of what I think is really important, and that is that we need to grow good food wherever we live. And so the model is not, did I just go out sound-wise? Well, at least now we know. Every 2 minutes we'll be replacing the battery. Is it maybe in backwards? I'll keep talking, and I think you can, well, I'll come in and out. So we have 3 acres of orchard. The other main thing I do well, my wife and I do on our farm is medicinal herbs. So my wife Nancy is an herbalist. So my own path, I went to Penn State. I have a degree in civil engineering. I did that career for 10 months. I went out again and okay, we're going to leave this on the table, and hopefully, yes, okay, stay away from the pocket. And after 10 months of that career outside of Washington, D.C., watching the sunrise and bumper-to-bumper traffic, I retired at the age of 23 and went on a path that eventually led me to planting apple trees in New Hampshire. And my intentions when Nancy and I got this farm was I certainly was going to do it organically. Now, what did that mean? That meant not using chemicals, but it didn't really mean a whole lot of depth beyond that. It meant substitute certain spray materials and have disease issues and pest issues, and there was a lot to learn. And as I started to discover things about the soil and about mycorrhizal fungi, my wife Nancy, and I'm telling you this little sidebar because it's really relevant to how I jump-started my path. My wife Nancy really wanted to learn about healing herbs, about medicinal plants. And the typical path there is you intern with an herbalist and you take classes. Typically there's 40 students and one of them might be a male, but mostly the women go for learning about this. And in these classes and going to herb conferences, you learn about making different medicines. You learn about all these conditions that different plants can help with. And then you come home. And Nancy looked around and there was only one person that she could see that she might be able to practice some of these newfound skills on. And this is where the herbal husband comes into play, has a prominent role. And suddenly I was being given remedies for all sorts of conditions I didn't even know I had. And I got better. I didn't even know I had to get better, but I got better. And one of the fundamental principles behind that herbal medicine was we don't address the symptom as much as we strengthen, boost the body's systems, the immune function, our immune system, our respiratory system, our digestive system. And I took that back to the field, out to my trees, and said, I want to figure out how to make the systems healthy. I want to know what makes for a healthy tree. I want to understand how plants naturally resist disease, what goes on. So it's a big, complicated story, but it led to my path, writing some books, and just constantly learning. Sometimes from research, sometimes from other growers, but mostly from the trees, from observing what's going on out there. So let's kind of set the scenario of where we're at. 3 acres, I do not have an economy of scale. I try to build in some common sense ways to not spend way too much money and have to live within your budget. Certainly as you scale up, you can afford better equipment, etc. But I wanted to figure out how we do this in a more small scale way. And as I said, I have 3 acres, but maybe you have an acre. Maybe you have 16 trees. That feeds your family. Maybe you've got fruit to contribute to your neighborhood. This is all under that network of community orcharding. One of the things in orcharding that's really relevant is there times that call for significant amount of labor. So one of the first things that we're going to be talking about today is the need to thin the crop. We're going to have a crop next year to get that crop load in balance. And there are some spray approaches to that, but it also involves some significant handling of the crop. And I'll get into the dynamics of that. But what that means is if you're also a market gardener and you're doing all these vegetable things in May and June, you have to recognize there could be some real peak times when there's an overlap, and can you do it all? That brings up the idea, notion of keeping it fun, keeping it happy. It's very easy to get very excited and plant lots of trees and plant lots of different fruits and plant your garden, etc. But there's a point where you'll recognize, I know what to do, I want to do it, but I can't quite get there. And when you scale up to such a point where you're not keeping up with what you want to do, it becomes less happy, it becomes more stressful. So that's something to keep in mind when you're thinking about, well, how much should I plant? You're going to also hear me weave in quite a bit this notion of farm zone organisms. So that this is a biodynamic principle. The notion of fertility of the farm ideally comes from the farm itself, or at least within the neighborhood, within the bio. And here we're addressing that question of how many inputs are necessary and how far do they come from. Doesn't mean that I don't have choices of things that I buy and bring in. But this notion of weaving in the whole ecosystem into the production of the crop is really important to me. And when you talk about all that sorts of things, we are definitely addressing resilience. Fruit growing is becoming much more difficult, not just for organic or high chemical growing. It's becoming more difficult because of the shifting climate patterns. And one of those scenarios that we've known for a long time is spring frost, freeze comes. But that's made a little bit more tenuous by the fact that in the middle of winter, not just winter, but many winters late, you can have a really warm, high warm spell, and wake buds out much too early before they're going to deal with what would be normal cold that comes along in late March, April. Another thing that's happening is much warmer falls. A warmer fall keeps the tree from hardening off quite as quickly. And 2 years ago, we got that fall, and suddenly in mid-November, temperatures got down near zero. And that was a really big transition. What we saw a few weeks ago when the whole vortex dropped temperatures really low, and then there was a 70-degree rise. That probably didn't hurt the bugs. But yeah, it's those events that are making things a little less sure. We'll also spend time looking at some of the community marketing ideas, and that gets exciting when I do try to live in this and kind of have a sense of what other people are doing. Now this is my friend Harry and Jackie Poacher up in Minnesota. They had as much as 30 acres for selling primarily farmers market and food co-ops. They are experiencing, everyone says we want organic apples. But then when the moments come, hey, perhaps a little bit more, or perhaps go to a little more off-market, the demand isn't necessarily there. And like many orchards, the hopes are one and one to part of cider. It's because of that diversity in your market. But they've also cut back some of the size of the orchard. One of the interesting things to think about is for every 100,000 people, if we each 20 pounds of apples a year, we're an apple, that's like nothing. But if we were each 20 pounds of apples a year, that would require 100 acres of orchard trees on that are trained to be standing trees. Now a fourth high density orchard is more. But when you think about that it would seem like such a great opportunity to sell fresh fruit, especially as start to realize fresh fruit understand the realm of apples or peaches or whatever your fruit is. There's more than varieties to find in the supermarket. In fact, it's outrageously more in many directions. Getting turned on to that. Again, 20 pounds seems like hardly anything. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for people. One of the challenges is it can be fairly complex. So I'm going to be explaining lots of things. And when we plant an orchard, when you plant your trees, they often come from the nursery and they're a whip and they're a bare root, ready to get into the ground and get situated. You might get a potted up tree and 2 or 3 years old, but basically you start with a whip. And over the course of a few years, strong crop change develop branches, crop load, and by year 5, 7, with apples, you're getting into the first really recognizable food production. Pears are going to take a little longer. Stone fruits are going to come sooner. Well, in this room, I don't know if there's a whip here. Some of you may be whips. And others are just coming in the beginning of bearing. Some of you have been here years, and you weathered storm and hail and frost and you're seducing. But the point is, it's like it takes a tree a certain number of years to come up to speed. We're also on the learning curve, and it takes a couple number of years to come up to speed. In fact, it takes a lifetime. I'm learning something new all the time. So as I'm standing up here and I'm giving you all the details and hopefully keeping interest inspiring, I think of myself as sowing seeds. And some of those seeds are ready to germinate right now today. No register for you. And others will be there a year or two and they say, that's right. I need to be giving some attention to that. And it's okay. If you're aware of it, just relax. Let the seeds fall. We're all ready to hear what we're hear and take it in our own. So the place I want to begin is with that notion of what makes for a healthy plant. And what I'm talking about now has to do with vegetables and medicinal herbs, flowers, as much as fruit, berries, and forage grasses, and everything. What makes for a healthy plant? In one sense, we can think of that's right out there, sunshine, certainly they're photosynthesized. Plants go on from there, they combine nitrogen with the plant sugars produced by photosynthesis to create proteins. Some of those will become fats. That's the way plants store energy. And that whole metabolic process is coming along. Plants will produce secondary metabolites, which I call resistance metabolites, which is basically the immune function of phytochemistry that gives the plant the ability to resist pests and disease. So all of that may seem like we put the plant in the ground and drain the ground, and it's going to proceed the way it's going to proceed. But in truth, we have a role to play to make sure that plant metabolism is robust versus sluggish. So photosynthesis. Begins right then. Yes, the sun shines every day. The sun shines. And carbon dioxide is taken in, and the energy of the sunlight leads to the creation of simple sugars. These are the carbohydrates, the photosynthesis, that plant is going to use to grow itself, sugar extension, development of leaves, development of fruit. But there will be times when the tree, the plant will trade more than half of sugars it's producing to the biology in the soil. So there's a really important connection down there. These plant sugars are basically carbon currency, and we're going to come back to that idea. The photosynthesis can be robust or it can be sluggish, and it all depends on the availability of an assortment of different trace minerals. So I'm talking about things like manganese and boron, copper, iron, zinc, molybdenum. Some soils are perhaps sufficient. More often it's the case that the biology piece is sufficient and not delivering these trace minerals. But again, as growers, we have a role to play here. And we'll talk about soil amendments and ideas like when you make a compost pile, occasionally sprinkling a dusting of azomite clay. Azomite is a soil amendment from the southwest, from the previous ocean ground. That deposit supposedly contains all the minerals from A to Z. Not that I'm advocating for azomite, but you get the idea. I'll weave that in here. Because we certainly want photosynthesis to be robust, because at its most basic, it means that a plant, a tree, has more carbon currency to trade with the biology in the soil. Plants take those simple sugars and combine them with nitrogen. Now, nitrogen can come in two different forms, and we're going to look at that piece. That in turn creates amino acids that are the building blocks of proteins. And amino acids start to combine, they form incomplete proteins called peptides, which in turn, if the metabolic pathway is going along well, become complete proteins. And I'm going to point out why that's really relevant, because in the sap of the plant, in the sap of the tree leaf, if there are simple sugars and a lot of free-floating amino acids, that's what pests and disease launch off of. So right now we're kind of talking about some science and some deep stuff that you don't think you need to think about when you're growing fruit or you're growing vegetables, but it's really the heart of the matter. On the nitrogen piece, we've known for quite a long time that when a fruit tree gets nitrogen primarily in the nitrate form, it is going to be a lot more susceptible to disease. So on a real simple level, that looks like this. You take the wheelbarrow into the barn and you muck out some sheep or horse or cow bedding, and then you go outside and you immediately dump the wheelbarrow right underneath the pear tree. The pear tree is super invigorated, the shoots really, really grow, and very likely, if conditions are right, around bloom time, the month after bloom time, the tree gets fire blight because it just had such invigorated growth. It didn't have the same resistance metabolism aspect going on. Now, on another level, it depends on what kind of soil ecosystem your fruit trees, your berry plants are in. So in a more bacterial-dominated ecosystem, I'm going to get into this a little more. There are a lot of nitrifying bacteria that take the nitrogen which is released from the soil food web when a microbe eats a microbe, when a protozoa eats a fungus or a bacteria. One of the waste products is nitrogen in the form of ammonium. And nitrifying bacteria convert that ammonium to nitrate, and then the tree, the plant, to utilize the nitrogen has to convert it back to ammonium. So that little side step takes energy, and whenever energy is used, metabolism can't go as far along as it's meant to. So in a fungal-dominated ecosystem, what happens is the rhizosphere is made a little more acidic, and that in turn does not favor nitrifying bacteria, and so the ammonium that's released by microbe-eating microbe goes into the plant as ammonium, and it saves a lot of energy. So I like to understand how things work, and I try to explain it, and I think it's a motivating thing to understand a little bit more about how these things are happening here on Earth. But one of the things I want you to know about me is, as I teach you like this idea of nitrifying bacteria, you can let it go in one ear and out the other. What you need to retain is concepts like mineralization and fungal connection. Those are like the core concepts, the threads that really make up the base of this tapestry that we're weaving here today. Back to plant sap. So in that plant sap can be an excess of simple sugars and amino acids, or those sugars may have been complexed and complete proteins tucked away so that it's a totally different substrate depending whether metabolism is robust or sluggish. The more sluggish metabolism that results in more simple sugars and amino acids in the plant sap, well, those pests that have simple digestive systems, think of the foliage pests primarily, caterpillars, aphids, etc., are only able to digest simple sugars and amino acids. When it gets more complex, those pests are not going to be interested in that more robust plant. So you see that in your gardens, you see that in your orchards. It's like, why on that end of the field am I experiencing that problem, but over here I'm not? And we often think about it as a soil fertility difference, and there can be that, but it more often is all the biological connections, and metabolism is not rolling along as much as it could be. Now in fruit growing, there are a number of different fungal spotting diseases. So here, things like apple scab, cedar apple rust, powdery mildew, frog eye leaf spot. And these fungal pathogens, a spore lands on the leaf, it sends out a hyphae. There's a whole kind of defensive process between the plant and that fungal pathogen for the hyphae to punch its way into the cell where it's going to access nutrients. So the plant tries to stop that and has successful ways of doing that. But when the hyphae taps in, it feeds off of amino acids that have not been complexed. So again, it's like, why did this particular tree of the same variety get scab? And over here I have the same variety, and it's a lot cleaner fruit. Now, it's more complex than that, but you start to get this idea that this is really relevant stuff. Beyond protein synthesis, next comes fat synthesis. So fats are stored in leaf cells, they're stored in stem cells, they're stored in the seed. Fats are directed to the root because that's a lot of energy for mycorrhizal fungi that have a tie into that. Fats are used to create essential oils. One of the primary places fats are directed is onto the surface of the plant, where the plant makes this waxy cuticle. So waxes are in the category of fats. And when you talk about brown rot on your peaches, the cuticle plays a major role in preventing rots from getting into the fruit. So we're going to look at that. So fats are important. And again, this robust business. A tree will produce 4 times as many lipids and fatty acid compounds if metabolism is robust. And where that really comes into play, we're going to learn about the timing of tender leaf tissue and the release of disease pathogens, and we're now talking spring, on going into bloom time, the other side of bloom. Well, a lot of diseases get their foothold in that season, and these diseases are released by rains. Rains mean that it's cloudy. That means there's a lot less photosynthesis. And if you have an extended wetting period, the disease pressure is a lot higher. And when a tree has set aside reserve energy in the form of fats, it can go back and start to break down those fats so that it has protein elements by which it can keep metabolism rolling along, and it can get through that rainy period. So what I'm talking about now is very briefly opening the door on fungicides. We think disease, fungicide spray kills the disease, and that's the way to move ahead. If we want to get away from some of the harsh chemical fungicides, then we have to have a sense of the alternative and more subtle methods of how we can support what plants are capable of doing. So we're going to get into that. Right now I'm setting the stage of the underlying principles behind the thinking that goes into what I call holistic orcharding. So these resistance metabolites include things like terpenoids and flavonoids and polyphenols, again, in one ear and out the other. The idea is we're getting there by mineralization and fungal connection. But this whole phytochemistry pathway is relevant not just to the tree being healthy, it's also related to the fruit being healthy for those who eat it. So it's good stuff. And we get there by the presence of a tad of disease that stimulates the tree to respond, We get there by using different foliar elicitors, and now I'm getting into opening the concept of holistic spray materials. What am I choosing, and how does that work? How does that help with what I'm talking about here? And that notion of reserve energy. So we've looked at one piece with respect to nitrogen. It's even more involved than that. But it comes about because of this fungal dominance in the soil. And we're going to talk about fungal foods and the kind of mulches, the right kind of plant companions that are going to help bring all this together. So we're going to make all this metabolism talk really practical in terms of what can we do to achieve this aspect going on. But right now, on a really kind of coarse level, one of the tools that eco-farmers use to really have a sense of what's going on with plant metabolism is a refractometer. And the refractometer is used to measure what is called the Brix. And the Brix is a measure of the soluble solids in the plant sap. Now some people think it's a measure of just the sugars, but it actually ties into that whole idea of proteins being complexed and fats being produced, and so it's a window into metabolism. So if you're looking at Brix, basically you take, well, if you wanted to do it with fruit trees, you take 3 or 4, perhaps 5 leaves from young growing shoots, and you take like the 4th or 5th leaf back from a shoot here, or shoot here, or shoot here. You take off the stem, you wad up the green leaf tissue, and there are these vice grips that have been converted with little flat angle plates, and you squeeze it, and it usually takes, loosen it, tighten it a little bit more, and usually takes 2 or 3 times till you get that drop or two that goes on to the refractometer, which then when you look at the light, the sugar water refracts the light, and that's where the scale, the Brix scale, comes into play. So I've used this just to get a sense of, I've made a holistic spray, Brix goes up. Is it still up 3 days later? Is it still up 7 days later, 10 days later? You don't do this as an everyday orchardist grower. It's kind of a fun tool to see that things are going right, and you might want to plug into it, but it's not essential. The real gist of Brix is what results in terms of keeping pests and disease at bay. What results when metabolism is robust versus sluggish. So this is a picture of a raspberry, and there's a little insect, couple little insects on that raspberry. Does anyone know what I'm showing you? It's spotted-winged Drosophila. So I guess we should also set this up. You know, some of you have never heard of spotted-winged Drosophila, is that right? Possibly? I always find that once you hear about a thing, you're going to get it. So just be prepared that the teachings become more relevant. But this is an insect that immigrated here from Japan about 10, 12 years ago. And it was brought into the West Coast. It's a fruit fly, but unlike North American fruit flies, the native fruit flies, this is a fruit fly that starts early. So it lays its eggs into immature fruit. So that bowl of overripe peaches on the kitchen counter where you get some fruit flies, you know, that's like a non-issue. But laying eggs into immature fruit means that as the fruit ripens and the egg hatches and there's larvae, and then you pick the fruit and you sell your berries at the farmer's market and your customers take a bite, if they don't happen to swallow the whole berry, you want to urge them to swallow the whole berry, they're going to see these maggots crawling in that fruit. Let's just spend a minute on this fruit fly. Another thing is that every 8 days, its life cycle repeats. So it only takes 8 days to go from egg to a mature fruit fly to lay an egg again. So this fruit fly got to the East Coast fairly rapidly, got to the Midwest fairly rapidly on the winds. But it was actually even more insidious than that. Probably about 6 years ago, I walked into the grocery store, August, early September, And you know how in the last 20 years we now can buy practically every fruit, every vegetable, every month of the year. It's there, comes from somewhere. And the fresh raspberries, the fresh blueberries, the fresh blackberries are sold as half pints, typically in a little plastic perforated container. Driscoll is the company. Berries grown in California are brought to all the other places where we live, where we should be growing our own berries. And I walked in and, you know, most people probably didn't notice, but I saw all these fruit flies coming out of these perforated containers. And it was spotted winged Drosophila being delivered to every bioregion across the country. So it moved really fast. So when you have this problem, this fruit fly does not overwinter where I am. So that means each year has to blow in from further south. So I don't know if that timing is true for Indiana. You might be what I call further south in the sense of growing zones. But for me, it doesn't make its presence known until really early mid-August. Further south, it makes its presence known by late June, early July. So if you're growing June raspberries, the ones that have the 2-year cycle on fruiting canes, you might miss this. But if you're growing fall raspberries, the ones that ripen in August and September, it is a major, major factor on that crop. Similarly, your early blueberries might be fine, but if you have late varieties, they might be being hit by this. They will go after stone fruits. So as plums ripen, as cherries ripen, this becomes really, really relevant. And we can get into how one might deal with that when I get into talking about insect measures. But what I want to say now is when you have put some conscious effort into mineralization and fungal connection and you have a more robust metabolism, it's a different degree of intensity that you face with respect to this pest. I'm not saying you don't see it, you don't get it, but it's not the same pressure that it's going to be found on weaker plants. And I'll also get into an example of that. And that's what we want. You know, there's often this search for, tell me which pear doesn't get fire blight. Tell me which pie cherry is not subject to brown rot. And there's something to be said for genetics to a degree, but the whole thing out there is evolving. It's really about growing healthy plants is where the answer lies to growing all these different fruits. So let's talk about the fungal piece now, fungal duff management. The very first picture slide introduces the answer to the question, where does a fruit tree want to grow? And the answer is on the edge of the forest, but I don't mean that literally. I mean that I want to duplicate the soil ecosystem that is found on the forest edge and bring it to where I'm growing my fruit trees. So this particular picture doesn't look like the edge of the forest. It's my daughter Gracie. This is what's known as a photo op. My daughter Gracie has never mowed in my orchard. My daughter this machine is not even running in this picture. I wanted a picture for the new book, the Holistic Orchard book. I had to take like 60 pictures so we could get the right aura, energy of serious worker out there in the orchard. But the reason I'm showing this slide here is this isn't forest edge, but even choices like mowing, we can emulate what's happening on the edge of the forest and go from more of a golf course fairway mentality to thinking more wildly. And yes, here's this BCS machine with a brush mower, but I'm utilizing it in a way that's going to push me in that forest edge direction. I'm going to share what that means. When I talk about why am I choosing that soil ecosystem, I'm essentially referring to the soil food web. And by this I mean the bacteria and the saprotrophic fungi and the acetomycetes that break down organic matter. I'm also talking about the mycorrhizal fungi that bring nutrients to the roots of plants. I'm also talking about the next trophic layer, protozoa and the nematodes that are the predators that consume the bacteria and fungi and through that release minerals. So those words, mineralization, immobilization, or assimilation, refers to microbe eats microbe, minerals are released, plants can take that up. Or microbes in growing and reproducing take up minerals and assimilate them, hold them over. And I think of, I'm talking about trillions and trillions of organisms here. More organisms in a handful of healthy soil than there are human beings on the planet. Though unfortunately humans are working to outpace that, but that's still a true statement. And I think of the soil food web as my team. And this is a little arrogant, but I assume that I'm the captain of the team. But I understand enough to know that I only have one job as the captain of this amazing team, and that is not to screw it up. That's my one job. There's many ways to screw this up, but as you start to look from that perspective, through that lens, and understand working with the soil food web is the key to being a successful biological grower, it's really going to open doors. So, what do I mean about forest edge ecology, soil ecology? Let's start with a monocrop cornfield. Year after year, use of herbicide, NPK fertilizer. Let's start with a housing development where soil's been removed, the topsoil, and then you basically have subsoil on top where they're going to plant grass. Let's start with a garden that is tilled a dozen times a year in order to keep weeds down. All of these are very disturbed soil scenarios, and by that, they're essentially a bacterial-dominated ecosystem. And as any one of those examples is let go, you will see over time, first annual reeds come in, mustards, things like that. Let another year or two go by, and now you start to have more perennial weeds, dandelion, dock, plants that have more organic matter. Biology is going to feed off of organic matter. Another year or two goes by, and succession tree species start to grow in that ground. First there's the raspberries or the blackberries. Then maybe it's some popple or pin cherry or it's pine. It depends where you are. And the tree species introduce lignins. So the whole kind of gradient of organic matter is now much more available, but it has lignins which fungi feed off of. So similarly, in the soil, the fungal component of the soil is going up. When you're in an old growth forest, the fungal biomass is about 100 times more than the bacterial biomass. So a gradient again, but it's at the edge of the forest, but the fungal biomass will be approximately 10 times that of the bacterial biomass. That's what you're going for. And you don't have to measure it. I mean, you just have to think forest edge thoughts. What does it look like on the edge of the forest? What am I bringing into where I'm planting and growing fruit trees? But that's what I'm referring to when I say the right soil biology. Some of that fungal biomass, a good portion, will be the mycorrhizal fungi. Some will be the decomposers, the ones that break down organic matter. The bacteria, I'm not belittling them. They're totally important still. But it's just we want to really favor the fungal element. So let's look a little deeper at the mycorrhizal fungal piece. And I'm going to talk about this more tomorrow. This picture is of the nutrient transfer mechanisms of what are known as endo, E-N-D-O, mycorrhizae, that actually penetrate into the cells of the root, and in exchange for carbon sugars, that mycelial mass brings different mineral nutrients to the plant. And that's really the driver of mineralization that comes from fungal connection. So we're going to look specifically at, well, what kind of mycorrhizal fungi do I want working in my orchard? So there are different types. I just mentioned the endo types, ENDO. And when we talk about inoculum products, that ENDO preface is going to be what you're looking for and should be thinking about. And the endomycorrhizae, basically, if I was a feeder root, this is a feeder root, left to my own devices, I can get nutrients in a soluble ion form that are brought to me by capillary action, by groundwater, to about 3/4 inches away. Endomycorrhizae form a mycelial mat around that feeder root that allows that root to absorb nutrients from as much as 4 to 6 inches away. Now, the other type that is associated with the trees of the forest, and here I'm talking both deciduous and coniferous type trees, so whether it's oaks or maples or pines or firs, form an affiliation with the ectomycorrhizae. And even though we're talking about pawpaws and apple trees and pear trees, they tend to be endo. And the ectomycorrhizae are ones that basically, on a feeder root, it looks like fingers in a glove. It's that tight. And the ectomycorrhizae send out long explorer hyphae that can go as much as 12 feet away. I'm going to come back to that distinction and why that might be relevant to us. This is, so you've already got the sense of feeder roots with endomycorrhizae reaching a little bit further. So now I do one of my amazing transformation tricks, and I'm an apple tree. And I don't care if you're seeing me as a seedling tree or a dwarf tree. I'm not a dwarf tree, but I don't care how you see me. And this represents my canopy, the edge of how far my branches go, how the extent I stretch out into the sunlight. And my root zone is approximately 2.5 times what you see above. So now envision that 2.5 times circle around me. Now, my roots in that soil volume only occupy about 3%, only access about 3% of that soil volume if I'm alone. So the fact that I have this affiliation with mycorrhizal fungi on feeder roots, just one fungi alone, means that I probably have access from 100 to 1,000 times more of the nutrients in my root zone. And that's really important. Think of that root zone as the shopping district for the tree. And if I don't have fungal friends, I'm totally relying on capillary water bringing me soluble ions. And it is very likely that I'm going to encounter what are called nutrient depletion zones, where I've used up the phosphorus I can reach. I've used up the calcium I can reach. And now that I have this mycorrhizal connection, it's a little bit more efficient, but it's much cooler than that. And that is that the more diverse the plant community up top, the more diverse the fungal community down below. And some plants, many plants, have multiple affiliations with different fungi. So that means if fungus A is bringing me nutrients into my plant sap, but it isn't necessarily that I need those nutrients as that plant in that spot, fungus B might pick up those nutrients through the same protoplasm and move them over into that side of the orchard. And so now I'm trying to create this idea that plant diversity has real relevance in terms of nutrient flow throughout a plant community. And this is a really, really important piece in terms of the layout of an orchard and what I'm thinking about when I choose different plants or let different plants be there. You know, apple trees or fruit trees in an herbicide strip with a narrow extent of grass, that's an orchard system, and people certainly work with that. But it's bereft of all these connections I'm talking about. And if I want healthy plant metabolism without pumping in the NPK, which is nitrates, which means I have to deal with more disease, which means I have to spray heavier duty fungicides in order to get this marketable crop. I mean, that's the way we do it. If I want to change that, I have to understand all the possible connections. And this business of fungal friends, endomycorrhizae, all the endomycorrhizae are invisible to our eyes. So I'm using words right now to try to convey what's going on, and I'll go further with this tomorrow. Invisible to our eyes doesn't mean that we can't access this. I think a really important growing skill is to be able to use your imagination, to use your intuition, and through that, really keep your consciousness on what I'm really doing here. Sure, I'm growing apples and I'm picking fruit, but what I'm really doing here is not screwing things up down there so that I can pick fruit that's really healthy for me and my family and my community. So mycorrhizal fungi carry forward in 3 different ways. One is to just the fact that the mycelium spreads, reaches further, connects new plants to the loop. A fungus can actually fuse into the hyphae of its own type, and that's called anastomosis. You know, in fruit growing we do grafting. Well, fungi do anastomosis. It's the same idea. And that also helps build the pipeline, build more efficient network connections. Fungi overwinter in root fragments. So with an apple tree, it's not root fragments, it's the permanent root system as part of that. But in annual cropping, in row cropping with corn, soybeans, in your garden with peas and garlic and tomatoes, they overwinter in root fragments. That tells you something. And that is that if you utilize surface decomposition and cut plants off rather than pull out the roots, you're leaving the fungi in place for next year. It's an important concept. And then they also, being fungi, they sporulate. They reproduce themselves. And in the case of endomycorrhizae types, which have an affiliation with about 85% of the plants on the planet, everything's invisible to us. Those spores are down underground. They're not like the ectomycorrhizae types, which have a fruiting body, a mushroom, or a puffball, which disperses spores into the air. That applies to trees in the forest. But the endotypes are down there in the soil. And if the place where we are planting that with the bare root system is one that has been degraded and highly disturbed, there's going to be a lot less fungal presence there. So if you're converting that monocrop cornfield to orchard, you know, the fungal piece is there to the slightest degree, but it's not going to connect immediately with your fruit tree. It might take several years. It might take a dozen years that you really want to jumpstart that connection. And that's where mycorrhizal inoculum comes into play. And this investment is really critical to the health of the orchard, of getting things off to the right start. So mycorrhizal inoculum, there's that distinction between endotypes and ectotypes. And the products that I like and recommend the highest have more diversity than not. So out in Oregon, there's a company called MycoApply. That's the mycorrhizae.com web address. And their core products have 4 species of endomycorrhizae, but the ones I really like have 9 different species. And different fungi have different skill sets. So one might be the one that's really adept at bringing zinc and getting it where it's needed. One might be really good at working with calcium and getting calcium moving around in that plant community. There's a few specific types that help move water. So if this side of the orchard is dry, the plant community as a whole, through these certain fungi, can direct water over to where it's more needed. So diversity is important. That's what we're really saying here. And I happen to like, just because, remember, it's an invisible realm, I got my imagination and my intuition, but there is a root dip product that Bioorganics in Pennsylvania makes. So when I'm planting a bare root trees out in an orchard, having a container of something I can dip in and actually see like that gel, which means that spores are clinging to the roots. And that's actually an important point too. Fungal spores have to be about within 3/16 of an inch of a root to get the signal to germinate to form the connection. So if you plant a tree here and throw the fungal spores over here, it won't be till the roots get over there and by chance encounter make that connection. So when you plant a tree and there's that root system exposed and I dip it in that gel, or whoever dips it in that gel, it's like you get this sense of, yes, fungal presence, I've done it. And if you're planting the tree and you don't see the gel, it's like, oh yeah, I forgot to dip it. It just helps you make sure you're doing what you want to do. There's also, so given what I just described, there's usually one or two people sitting there silently thinking to themselves, crap, I planted my trees 2 years ago and I have to dig them up and dip them in this dip. No, you don't. There's other ways to go about it. So they make powdered and liquid formulations as well. You know, one of the first steps that I will recommend when working with someone as a consultant who's taken over an orchard that's been managed chemically is we need to get that fungal aspect in there. And the way to do it is, whether it's a powder or the liquid formulation, and often the powder formulations are soluble, is mix it in your spray tank. Open the nozzle up wide and go along the ground where the roots are going to be found. Do this in the evening because endomycorrhizal spores are degraded by daylight, and do it on an evening when it's going to rain or you are going to irrigate and you can get it down in. You know, on a home scale, there's even more ways to go about it. It's not like you have to buy product. Think about a healthy, diverse, ideally forest edge ecosystem somewhere in your neighborhood. And it may not have wild apple trees or wild pear trees growing there, but it will have raspberry and goldenrod and those types of plants. And just by going to that forest edge ecosystem, taking away an inch or so of soil and taking a few yogurt cups worth back to where, let's say you have 6 trees that you planted 2 years ago in your yard, and moving the mulch, the top layer away, so you're about an inch or so down, you're going to be that much closer to the roots. You're introducing root fragments and you're introducing spores that could launch your trees. Now, that's hit or miss in terms of the varieties, but it's also a way you can do it. You know, that's not something you're going to do if you're planting an acre of orchard. But if you have a few trees, you get this principle of where's the right types of species that I want to work with, and how can I inoculate my tree system. And the spore aspect, it's a lot like sourdough bread, if any of you are bakers. You know that you take a little bit of the dough in order to carry the yeast forward. It doesn't take much. When you're inoculating a root system with the powder, it's about a ½ teaspoon of powder, which is probably representative of 600-800 spores, which has those 9 different varieties. Not everyone might take, but that's how you start to build the diversity. And you're going to build that further over the years to come, but it starts with inoculating a tree at a cost of probably 7-8 cents a tree if you're using that root gel product. In any given healthy ecosystem, there are as many as 50 different species of mycorrhizal fungi at work. And in our garden plantings, our orchard plantings, I'm talking almost all endomycorrhizae fungi. So again, that diversity piece is important. I always consider it really like a badge of honor, like someone patting me on the shoulder and saying, job well done, when I see mushrooms growing in the berry patch or and out in the orchard. Now, this mushroom here is not a mycorrhizal fungi. It's a sapotrophic, a decomposer. That's what we're going to see. We're never going to see the mycorrhizal piece. But we're going to know that if there's plenty of mushroom activity of another sort, it's a fungal place that we're doing right. So all that talk, and we're back to the 2 key points, mineralization and fungal connection. How do we go about that? So let's start with the concept of fungal banking. So there are a few ways that you can enhance the forest edge aspects of the location where you've chosen to plant fruit trees and berries. One of these ideas comes to us under the banner of what is called hugel culture. And this is an idea that comes out of Germany, Austria. You'll read about it and hear about it in permaculture circles. There's a guy over there named Sepp Holzer. He has a book and he talks more about hugelkultur. But the basic idea is burying woodsy debris. And burying, I'm going to get into the difference between aerial decomposition and soil decomposition. But what you're doing is you're putting a lot of organic matter. As it starts to break down, it's going to hold moisture, so it becomes a moisture bank. It's going to be a place where white rot fungi are really going to thrive, so they're the wood decomposers, which in turn release nutrients from the lignins that mycorrhizae pick up to trade back with your orchard partners. In its garden form, it typically takes the process of trenching, putting fallen wood or branches that you pruned, and then taking the soil and covering it again, maybe adding some old hay, maybe adding some compost. And in an orchard form, it does involve a degree of disturbance depending on how much you're getting into it. I do a lot more under the banner of what I'll call mini hugelkultur. I'll get to that. But in designing an orchard, typically on more sloped ground situations, in order to hold water and also to have better equipment access, the idea of creating terraces can be helpful. So the upper portion of this picture shows what's often done out in places like California where it's a lot drier. And the trench itself is filled with wood chips or woody debris because that's going to help hold moisture as it comes down the slope. As you get more east, the bottom part of this picture is more how I see it. And there the trench is built in order to create the terrace, but the terrace on the front part of the hill, of the little banking, is where the woody debris goes in a more extensive manner to beef things up. So the tree itself is not so much planted on top of a hugelkultur bank as it's planted alongside. So some people do big mounds and flat areas, and this whole choice really is predicated by the fact that there's woodsy debris around you. You don't go and get a truckload of fallen logs from the forest in Ontario and bring it down to Indiana if you're surrounded by cornfields. I mean, you might have a place where you can go get some woodsy debris, but if on your site you have woodsy debris to deal with, or there's larger logs that have fallen in the forest that you might pull some out, that's utilizing a resource that's available to you on that site, and that's how I see utilizing this. This is an orchard that someone planted in a lawn setting, and then new owners decided, let's make this more forest edge. And so they did a trench, and they buried some woodsy debris and built these swales. Now this is not commercial, because you couldn't take a tractor through there, but you start to get this idea. It's not like the whole scope of the land. It can be pockets here and there, and that's kind of a forest edge thought. It's not uniform on the edge of the forest. It's pockets here and there. Another concept is that of biochar. So understanding biochar a little bit better, biochar is the carbonized embers left after a fire, and whether that's a deliberate fire set and then deliberately smoldered in order to leave more embers, or it was a prairie fire over the centuries. Even in that kind of grassland fire, 2 to 3% of the organic matter is carbonized, and left behind is a biochar powder. And the crystalline porous spaces in biochar are almost like magnets in terms of attracting transferable nutrients to those exchange sites. And that's why I use the term rechargeable battery here. And this carbon battery is operated specifically by fungi. So in this picture, on the far side is a bean root, and further down, those are the root hairs coming off of the root. And this is a macroscopic realm, and it's all minute, but what I just talked about is all rather blunt. Over here is a piece of biochar, and those carbonized porous spaces are accessed only by the fine hyphae of fungi. to pull the nutrients out of the transfer site. So the way I utilize biochar is as an investment for my launching this fungal ecosystem in the planting hole. And ideally that takes the form of about a ½ pound of biochar that's put a little in the hole, more so on the dirt that I'm backfilling when I tamp in the root system, and some of it even beyond that that's left on the surface. And I have not been buying biochar, nor do I officially make biochar, but we heat with wood. And so when I sift the wood ashes are not biochar, but I get the black chunks left from burning the wood boiler, and there are 2 wood stoves. That gives me a little bit of biochar to launch that fungal ecosystem. The idea of activating biochar means taking 12 to 24 hours before applying it and soaking it in something like urine or compost tea or manure tea so that nutrients go to those exchange sites rather than grab the nutrients from the soil. So in this case, I'm planting this fledgling tree, and by the time the roots spread, I probably don't need to charge it, but it's still a good practice. But in the case of like if you were applying on vegetables which need nutrients immediately, you absolutely have to charge it. So that's a distinction worth making. Right. So when I talk about the soil food web, I use those words mineralization and assimilation. There's 1/3 step more beyond that, known as humification. This is the creation of humus. So in the prairies, those 30 feet deep soils, that was a different process. But as you move east, where the forest was the dominant ecology, our soils are forest derived. And the rot fungi that decompose woodsy matter are the real drivers of that long-term fertility being put in the soil. And this is where we really get into the idea of a fungal food, the ideal being certain tree species in a form that their green cambium cells, the soluble lignins, are still available to jumpstart this humification process that I'm talking about. And now I want to talk about some research that was begun at Laval University in Quebec in the 1970s and 80s. And the researchers asked the question, what can we do with the tops of trees left from logging jobs for agricultural purpose? And the idea here is certainly branch tops could be left in the forest to build the forest soil back, but for agricultural purpose. And it's not just literally the tops of trees, but it's the smaller portion of the woodsy growth, which now takes us to the shrub growth growing along fence lines or growing along the roads. And they identified a couple of key factors. One was that smaller growth, 2.5 inches in diameter or less, is where 75% of the minerals stored in that woodsy species will be found. So in the bigger growth, the stem wood, whether it's big enough to cut lumber from or it's firewood status or fence pole status, relatively speaking, there's not that much green cambium cells in proportion to the interior wood. And the distinction there is not just the minerals, but also the carbon to nitrogen ratio. So in the smaller wood, the twigs and the buds, the carbon to nitrogen ratio averages about 40 to 1. It's about 70 to 1 right at that 2.5 inch diameter. And 40 to 1 is a fungal sweet spot. It's something plants work with. That's what we want. When you get into the bigger wood that really should be lumber or firewood, the carbon to nitrogen ratio typically is 300 to 1 to as much as 700 to 1. And now you're talking about a scenario where all that carbon locks up nitrogen. But in the first scenario, that's not happening because it's a fungal sweet spot. The biology can work with that. Another thing they found was that it makes a distinction if the wood source is deciduous hardwood or if it's softwood. And that distinction is who comes into play first to start breaking down that woodsy matter. And in the case of softwoods, pine, spruce, fir, the brown rots, I'm using generic terms now. These are decomposition fungi that appear brown, so we call them the brown rots. Later on, you're going to hear me talk about brown rot on peaches and cherries, but that's a different organism. Right now, we're talking generically. The brown rots take basically the cellulose in softwood material, and they leave the one lignin behind. And in that process, for the first 6 or 9 months of getting that decomposition going, they produce allelopathic compounds that inhibit the growth of deciduous trees. So that helps protect the softwood niche. That's one of the factors in a forest ecology. In your orchard ecology, you're growing deciduous trees. And in the early years, to mulch with fresh softwood material is going to set back the growth of your tree because of what the brown rots are going to do. Now, as the tree gets bigger and into the bearing years, that becomes a little less relevant, just proportionally. There's a much bigger root system. But what I do when I have primarily softwood material is I let it age. I let that 6 to 9, if not 12 months go by before I use it. I might use softwood material fresh in the blueberry patch. It's a different scenario. I might use it as garden paths. I might mix it with compost to make orchard compost. We're going to get into that. I often will also use it as bedding, but it's not like sawdust, bedding for animals. It's not like sawdust where it's just the carbon piece, the big stem. It's got the green cambium, it's got the mineral nutrition. So that's important, but it's the hardwood material that the white rots break down. And the white rots are the ones that make humic substances from the 2 lignins found in deciduous type trees. And that's the basis of long-term fertility. That's what I really want to plug into. If I can accelerate that process in my orchard, that's a good thing. And just one further bit. I'm going to generate this from trees growing on my farm, and to a degree you can too, and then there's also sources from outside the farm. But if you're thinking landscape center thoughts right now in terms of wood mulch, and you go there, so one of the options is bark mulch. And bark mulch is typically softwood species from mature logs where they've cut the 2x4s, the dimensional lumber. That bigger, thicker bark on mature trees is really rich in tannins, which is also going to set back growth. And if you really want to screw things up for your team, you know how you can go to the landscape center and you can get a different colored bark mulch. You can get pleasantly brown. You can get black. I don't know why anyone would choose black, but you can get red. Well, that's toxic dyes to make that human aspect seem really great, but it's not. It's really that's about as far as you can grow to screw up your team, that combination of factors. If you're really limited to the landscape center, hardwood bark mulch would be your choice. It's not the ideal, it's not what I'm talking about, but in this case, a lot of the carbon's been taken away and it's just the bark. And hopefully you're getting some of that cambium mineral nutrition with that. It hasn't been peeled too far out, but it also doesn't have the same tannin element. But ideally, we're going to look at some other sources. So now let's also be sure we understand this idea of, I'm talking about raw meal chipped wood. I'm trying not to use the word mulch because it's in our gardening grower consciousness that mulch suppresses weeds and that's how we keep everything looking neat and trim in the landscape. That's not a forest edge thought. That's a human thought. I want a forest edge thought. So when I'm chipping directly myself, I'm going to see twigs. I'm going to see chunks of wood. I'm not looking for it to be all uniform and break down faster. It's forest edge-like. I do have a tractor, and I have a Wallenstein chipper made in Canada. And when I prune, I chip that brush out in the orchard. Think about what you prune off of an orchard tree. It's small wood and it's coming from a deciduous type species. It's ideal. So pruning should be returned to the orchard. Now let's take it a little bit further. It isn't like they have to be run through a chipper. I am chipping the bigger wood, but the smaller shoots that I remove, I drop to the ground, provided they can lay essentially flat. So a water sprout growth that grows straight up, that's going to lay flat. But a branch that's several years old and has crooks and turns, that's going to stick up in the air. And there's a difference in what's going to happen to that wood in terms of decomposition in an aerial environment versus a soil environment. So besides your prunings, you might have farmland where there's sections you want to keep more open. There might be some wet areas where species like alder or willow are growing that you can essentially coppice, cut off, but it regrows from the roots, but utilize that material. Whenever you see, and I don't know if the Asplund company is out here, but whenever you see those trucks, and if they're working clearing under a power line or along a road where it's mostly deciduous type growth, maybe it can be as much as like 20% softwood and you still call it deciduous. You want to stop. And you want to say, there's a cold bottle of my cider that I made waiting for you. And if two of you are neighbors in this workshop, you're going to get into a bidding war and it'll accelerate. But even if you give a whole case of beer, it's worth it for that whole truckload of chips. Commercial landscapers are another potential source. Getting your town transfer station to work with chipping, and that's a level of consciousness. I haven't found a town really doing too much with that, but that would be potentially another source. So I have a spot where the chippers can come in. I may not even know they're coming. I may not even had to invest a cold bottle of cider. I'll make sure they get it if they come. This pile has been 10, 12 times bigger than what you see here. Depending on the time of the year that it comes, if it's in summer with a lot of leafy growth, I'm going to let it sit because it has a lot more nitrogen from those leaves. If it's fall, winter, early spring, and I don't have the leaf growth, I can apply it fresh. When I have a pile that I let sit, another thing I'll do, depending on the timing, let it go through that heating phase where it really heats up. It gets incredibly hot in wood piles. But once it starts to cool, and I know it's still going to be a couple months till I'm going to get it out there in the orchard, or maybe not until spring. It's now mid-fall. If I happen to have a bag of sawdust spawn of wine cap mushroom, the garden giant, I'll stick some spawn in that pile, and then I go and I spread the chips the next spring. If not that year, the next year, I'll see all these edible garden giant mushrooms come up, wine cap mushrooms. I'm trying some other species in that sense as well, but that's like the surefire bet of getting into having some edible mushroom just happening because you're working with woodsy debris that's decomposing. Now in a commercial orchard, what's typically done is prunings are thrown into the aisleway, and then they can run down the aisleway with what's called a flail chopper. So that's a big, expensive attachment, and you need a big tractor to run it, which gets into that economy of scale thing. But this was good. This is so much better than taking that woodsy matter out of the orchard to burn it and sending all that biological energy into the sky and just being left with some mineral ash. This is putting woodsy material out there in the orchard. It's not as ideal as what I do, where I blow it under the trees into what I'm going to introduce as the fungal duff zone. But it's in the aisle, and it's part of that soil ecology, and this was a good step. Now let's understand the aerial soil decomposition bit a little bit more. So up in the air, one of the organisms that breaks down a brush pile or a dead limb in a tree is called black rot. And black rot has a sporulation phase, and when those spores land on young apple leaves, in the month following blossom time. It causes any infection that takes hold is called frog eye leaf spot. And these spots are purple, and then they become tan, and then they fall out in the center. So if you're seeing a little of this, it's not a concern at all. But if you're seeing a lot, and you're seeing it to the extent that your trees are actually defoliating by late summer, you want to be tuned into where's it coming from, and what might I do about it. Let's look at the where's it coming from piece. I have a friend in California, Mendocino County, Tim, and Tim bought a existing orchard, pears and apples, 10 acres, and for the most part those trees were above deer height because they were like 40, 50 years old. But here and there was a tree missing. And so Tim replanted that tree, and now that was all at deer height. So Tim got concerned about deer damage to the tree. What can I do? And his thought was, all right, I'm pruning all this brush off. I'm going to build a wall. We know about no, I shouldn't do that. I'm going to build a wall. Definitely like block all the places where the deer are coming in. And it worked great. But these brush piles are being broken down not by soil organisms, but by black rot. And within 2-3 years, he started to see this purple spotting on his leaves that he'd never seen before. And it got serious enough that closest to the brush piles, trees were actually defoliating by late summer. And I told him, black rot. You can't have brush piles. Similarly, what's one of the first things you see, first bits of advice you see in a pruning book? Remove the dead limbs. Well, that's aesthetic, but it's also, that's a source of black rot. Another thing, the same company, the Asplund company, typically in New England anyway, is given the instruction, remove all those trees under the power line. Oh, but leave those wild apples because that provides food for wildlife. And so there's the tree going up into the power line, and they come through with a bunch of heading cuts and leave stubs. You know, were we to open the Pandora's box of pruning and talk about that, we would use up the rest of the day. So I'm not going to open Pandora's box here. But when you cut across a limb and leave a stub, that's cut may callus partially, but typically doesn't, especially as you get into bigger wood, and so it rots. And now here's this black rot sporulating on top of the tree, and it often leads to killing the tree. In a similar manner, even if you're pruning out all the dead wood and you're not making brush piles, that doesn't mean that a maple tree or some other species in the forest doesn't have a dead limb and spores are coming into your orchard. And besides the leaf phase, sometimes it works its way into branches, not young growth, but older branches, 20, 30, 40 years old. And that's what this first picture is. And it will essentially girdle that branch, and you may not notice that branch in decline one growing season, and the next year it's dead. And it's like, what happened here? I mean, why? I'm a good person. I'm doing healthy plant metabolism, and yet it happened. That's black rot. And like, I'm losing a tree I really loved, and I've tried to cut it out, but it just had gotten a hole deep enough down on the trunk that I've grafted new trees. So that's my way of reproducing it. So things happen, but sometimes they happen because we set them up. So soil decomposition becomes important. Now, when I spread raw meal chip wood, with a younger tree, I do it a little more extensively, but I'm not mulching. So my goal is to go out there with a bucket load, or maybe one tree gets half a bucket load, and the neighboring tree gets the other half, or maybe it's a wheelbarrow. You know, it's your scale, amount of chipped wood you have, and I dump it as a pile. And I kick it around a little bit, but I still leave it like 4 to 5 inches thick in the middle, and I spread it out. And then the next year I come out on the other side of the tree and dump a load. And the next year it's over here. And that's very forest edge-like. Things are not uniform. Now there's different stages of decomposition where roots are going to find nutrients to grow that healthy crop. A year of that thicker pile in place, smothers the grass. It becomes really easy to transplant into that the next spring if I want to get specific plants like mountain mint or comfrey growing as I start to increase the diversity in my orchard. But think about pockets. That's the approach here. This fungal duff zone, back to being a tree, is a foot or two beyond where you see that canopy. That doesn't mean there's not roots out further, but that's your aisleway, or maybe it's your yard. But it's that zone underneath the tree that you want to bring those fungal foods to. Similarly, when you plant a young tree, its reach is here in year 3, 4. It isn't until year 5, 6, 7 that you're starting to put it further out. But you're creating that forest edge, fungal-dominated ecosystem and expanding it as your tree grows. So it doesn't matter if you're growing a full-size tree, or you're growing a semi-dwarf, or you're growing a row of dwarf trees on trellis. The more that you can use fungal duff management techniques, the more health you're going to derive from the connections of the fungi. So that can take all sorts of forms. One of the things most of us have access to, typically, and we don't want this to happen, but farmers who are putting up hay, a thunderstorm comes, and so the value of that forage is lost, and it becomes mulch hay. What I do with mulch hay, get a truckload, come home, is I throw a bale here and there. This is going a little off the fungal connection part, but it's thinking more broadly. And the reason I'm doing that out in the orchard, throwing a bale of hay here and there, is that I want field mice to nest in that bale of hay. Now, field mice are not voles that girdle the bark of the trees. Field mice are field mice. It's what hawks eat and foxes eat and all the other predators that'll help not just keep field mice numbers balanced, but hopefully voles and squirrels and all that too. The reason I want field mice making that nest in late summer, fall, is they go on, have their young, and move on. And in the spring, one of the happiest first sounds of spring for me is that deep throbbing hum of bumble queens coming out of hibernation, looking for a place to establish their nest, which is where they'll lay first brood, which, if everything proceeds at the right pace, are the primary pollinators of apple trees in a natural ecosystem. And their favorite place to put a bumblebee nest is an abandoned field mouse nest. So then I have that next summer of bales decomposing, but the bees are doing their thing, and by fall they're done, and the bumble queens have gone on to hibernate in some other spot, and I can tear that bale apart and utilize the organic matter, which the fungi are then going to take and make heyday with, so to speak. Because we do medicinal herbs, we have a drying tunnel, and I literally go to forest clear cuts where red raspberry is growing and get a pickup load of red raspberry canes. They're in the tunnel for 24 hours. We strip the leaves. Those canes, they go out in the orchard here and there as piles, ideally in a slight shallow spot, ideally where you throw some old hay or some kind of compost or bedding over it, and that's mini hugelkultur, very forest edge-like. Raspberries grow on the forest edge. There's lignins in it. I'm just utilizing resources in a different way that tie into what I do. You know, I'm not telling you to go get a pickup load of raspberry canes and do that. I mean, for us, it has crop value. But let's also just briefly look at that. So if you are growing raspberries, you probably know the dictum that you're supposed to remove and burn the canes that you prune out because you don't want to spread some kind of virus or some kind of bacterial disease. And were you to just take those canes and make a brush pile, that potential is there. But when you do hugelkultur, you put it into a soil decomposition environment. This is why I keep stressing this. You change who's who and who's going to break it down. And those diseases they thrive in an aerial environment. They're not a soil kind of organism. And so you change the dynamics and you can utilize those lignins and it's all to the good. We'll be talking about the importance with a younger tree or with plantings on more dwarfing rootstock, you have to keep the ground more open so that the roots can take off and the energy goes into branch structure, or in the case of the dwarf trees, they just don't have the oomph to compete as well with other plants. But there comes a point where a tree's starting to bear. It's got a branch structure that's shading the ground. I planted some comfrey, and I'm going to get into these choice of plants around the drip line, and it becomes much more of a cruise control system. It looks like the forest edge in early spring underneath these trees, because grasses aren't just popping up. They've been suppressed and moved out into more of the direct sunshine. And that's nice, because just as the trees are aging, I'm also aging. It's like I like a little less work. I don't have to do quite as much to keep that ground open. So let me just talk about the growth cycle. Oops, what did I do? Did I do something? No, okay. Of what's going on with the roots and what's going on with how I might start to tie into the timing of things that I do in the orchard. So that, I think your handout has the fungal curve version of these same drawings. So that's in your handout. And I'll talk about the fungal curve. So we come out of winter, and the snow melts, or we just didn't have a lot of snow cover, but we come out of winter, and as things start to warm, the longer days, the temperature's getting a little bit higher each day, hopefully. The accumulated warmth of the sun is what drives the pace of growth and also the pace of insect development and potential disease development. And buds swell, green tissue shows. Meanwhile, down below, it's a sleepy place, and there is not really any outreach of the feeder roots nor the mycorrhizal fungi. There's no nutritional uptake going on. And all that growth in spring is being driven by nutrients that were stored the previous fall. So we're going to look at that. But one of the ways to really drive this point home is, let's say you planted your young trees, and maybe you read a book that suggested, well, you want to make sure you protect that trunk from voles, especially under snow cover. Voles will move in and they'll girdle the bark, and snow melts, and you see that your young tree has been girdled, and you're chastising yourself because you didn't follow the advice, you never did a vole guard. Or if the snow's got deep, you didn't go out with snowshoes and stomp it down, so there wasn't as, why does that happen? If I tap the floor, I change the screen. Wow. It doesn't take much to throw me off. Vole guards. And you see the tree is girdled, and you say, well, I lost that tree. Its connection with the roots of getting nutrients, of getting moisture is gone. But you don't get to removing it. And then you see that the buds swell and green tissue shows, and it goes into bloom, and it has green leaves. And by that point you're thinking, I don't know why me, but somehow me, I've been selected for immaculate conception, and my tree is going to live. And once you have that thought, within a week or two, we're now talking like somewhere in June, all that growth shrivels up and dies because the tree had been disconnected. But the point is that the nutrients were there already. So we go a little bit further along. Grass is starting to grow. Blossom buds are showing some color, first pink. And during that time, you'll see shoots elongating on your tree. And they might grow 3 to 5 inches. But down below, it's still a sleepy place. Things are not happening. The bees come. We're on the other side of bloom. The petals fall off the tree, the blossom petals, and you don't think about it, but that shoot growth that happened going into bloom has stopped. There's a pause. And when things pause above, the tree is sending its photosynthates down below because it's an important nutrient uptake time with the biology. And so shoot stopping growth, just as fruit set, indicates the beginning of the what I call the spring feeder root flush. Right now I'm specifically talking about apples and pears and quince, pome fruits. Stone fruits have this, but there's some parts of the dynamics change a little bit. Is that happening a lot? Because every time I look, it's like blinking and moving on me. What's going on is those photosynthetes are going down, and just as the tree is reaching into the top inches of the soil, it's taking up nutrients to grow this year's crop and also to develop flower cells for next year. And as feeder roots reach out, mycorrhizal fungi reach out. So when I talk about the timing of mowing, there's a real benefit to knocking down the other plant cover, other than a few select species of plants, right after bloom, because then you shock the collective root systems to favoring the fruit tree. So we'll get into that, but it's based on what's going on. And then maybe 3 to 4 weeks after bloom, you'll notice those shoots start to elongate some more. And that means that down below, things have stopped. 90% of those spring feeder roots slough away. They were just there for that short-term job. And instead, the tree's now putting the energy back into growth and development up top. What this tells us is that in the late June, July window, if we are managing dwarf trees, say, or they're young trees and we want to do a cover crop, we're disturbing a lot less of the feeder root and the mycorrhizal fungal system at that point than we would be earlier or later. We go into August, and somewhere from mid-August to late August, there's an important event that's known as terminal bud set. And terminal bud set is about shoots stopping growing, and that cessation of growth indicates the beginning of the tree hardening off. And the tree has to harden off back through the branches and down through the trunk, so that by the time serious cold comes in late fall, it's ready to deal with that. So one aspect of this hardening off process is come the end of August, September, October, we don't want to do anything that invigorates the apple or the pear tree. So now I'm talking about pruning. I'm talking about spraying like some form of nitrogen, like liquid fish. All that's to be cut off because we want the tree to harden off so it's going to survive the winter well. The fact that the terminal bud set meant that shoots are no longer growing, that means that something is happening down below. And that something is the fall feeder root flush. And this is the root flush where fungi are going to work with those feeder roots to bring nutrients to store in the cambium and the twig and the bud cells that's going to drive next year's growth. So one of the things I do is right after harvest, that's the timing for spreading compost, because this is when the tree is taking nutrients for next year. And I'm doing this with the fall feeder root flush in part because the compost will also play a role in helping to decompose the fallen leaves where diseases are going to overwinter for next year. So we're just weaving together a tighter tapestry here of making what we do more effective in terms of what is going on with the tree. So let's take what I call a 5-minute break. That means 5 minutes ideally. And go get coffee, tea, or go to the bathroom, and then we'll resume. Event that's known as terminal bud set. And terminal bud set is about shoots stopping growing, and that cessation of growth indicates the beginning of the tree hardening off. And the tree has to harden off back through the branches and down through the trunk so that by the time serious cold comes in late fall, it's ready to deal with that. So one aspect of this hardening off process is come the end of August, September, October, we don't want to do anything that invigorates the apple or the pear tree. So now I'm talking about pruning. I'm talking about spraying like some form of nitrogen, like liquid fish. All that's to be cut off because we want the tree to harden off so it's going to survive the winter well. The fact that the terminal bud set meant that shoots are no longer growing, that means that something is happening down below. And that something is the fall feeder root flush. And this is the root flush where fungi are going to work with those feeder roots to bring nutrients to store in the cambium and the twig and the bud cells That's going to drive next year's growth. So one of the things I do is right after harvest, that's the timing for spreading compost, because this is when the tree is taking nutrients for next year. And I'm doing this with the fall feeder root flush in part because the compost will also play a role in helping to decompose the fallen leaves where diseases are going to overwinter for next year. So we're just weaving together a tighter tapestry here of making what we do more effective in terms of what is going on with the tree. So let's take what I call a 5-minute break. That means 5 minutes ideally. And go get coffee, tea, or go to the bathroom, and then we'll resume.